Hello everyone and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today I've got yet another individual album review as I'm talking about the newest album from Boards of Canada, Inferno. Alright, so I've got a bit of a challenge for myself with this one. See, there's reasons I wanted to give this album its own individual video, partially because it's going to be a bit of a challenge for me, again. Now, for those of you who don't know, although if you are watching this video you likely do know, Boards of Canada are a Scottish electronic music duo who have been active for 4 decades now, and they've been releasing studio albums since the 1990s. And this is only their 5th album to date, and also their first since 2013. Now, I've been hearing about this band for a while now, and I know they're quite legendary, but I wasn't totally sure why or what kinds of music that they made, until I finally took the time to listen to their first 4 studio albums. And I've seen this band's music described as Hauntology, which isn't a genre that I've really dove into that deeply and is absolutely very intriguing to me. Now, before I get into talking about all this, it is worth mentioning that this new album from Boards of Canada is quite likely the most critically acclaimed album of this year thus far, or at the very least one of them. And of course, I have to wonder how much of it is just because it's Boards of Canada, so it's biased, and the album is just so highly anticipated by so many people, so that means people are just saying, oh yeah, it's one of the best albums of the year. But I also do think it's easy for me to overestimate other people's bias and underestimate my own, so maybe it's not fair for me to criticize people for this specifically. It is just worth mentioning, though, I can't help but wonder about that. And I was absolutely excited to hear this, though, considering just how positive the reviews have been. So I decided to give myself the challenge of finding enough things to say about this project in its own individual review, and during the time when I was writing this, I was even writing how I'm not totally sure where this review is going to go, and this might completely go off the rails, so just be prepared for that, although now, as a result of being done writing the review, I do know approximately where the review is going. And yeah, just stay tuned to find out just how off the rails this goes, or if it does go off the rails or not. So just be prepared for that, because especially when I'm reviewing an album that's mostly instrumental, it's hard to really find an objective meaning in it. And thus my interpretations can be quite specific to how I personally hear it, which is true with pretty much any kind of music, but especially music that's mostly instrumental. And this brings us back to talking about hauntology, which according to Wikipedia is a range of ideas referring to the return or persistence of elements from the social or cultural past as if to haunt the present. I quoted that word for word, I believe, off of the Wikipedia page on hauntology. And it's made its way into music in a genre that's pretty much based on that concept, often using a lot of old samples. And the funny thing is, the idea of hauntology is actually quite new. It's only really been around since the 1990s when the term was coined by French philosopher Jacques Derrida. I hope I pronounced that correctly. And Boards of Canada were already an active group at that time. And honestly, I'd love to really explore this genre and concept more. And I find it fascinating, especially because a word like hauntology really feels like it sums up a lot of what you'll find on Boards of Canada's albums beyond just being the technical term for this kind of music. Because it can be pretty goddamn haunting. I'd say my favorite of those first 4 albums was probably Geogotti because it was a bit more consistent than the others, but I really liked all 4 of them, although it may have been a bad idea to try and listen to them when about to go to sleep, but it did have a really fascinating effect where I was quite enthralled by just how haunting some of the moments on those albums are. Anyway, I think with all of this being said, it's time for me to get into talking about this specific album, and I'm going to try to go through it track by track, although again, it might very much go off the rails. Again, it feels weird reading this out loud because, again, I know what direction this review goes in for the most part. But hey, I guess you gotta watch and find out. And yeah, this may or may not be a super typical review because I was thinking going into this, I might just use it as an excuse to yap about random stuff, all with the excuse of, but I'm reviewing an album. And yeah, I guess stay tuned to find out where this goes. Let's get right into talking about the album, going track by track. So yeah, the album starts with the very short intro track, Introit, which I don't really have anything to say about other than that it's an intriguing way to start the album. Then the second track is over 5 minutes, and it's called Prophecy at 1420 megahertz. I believe that's what MHZ is, megahertz, I think. And it's worth mentioning that a lot of the things I'm discovering from this album are from Genius.com and a little bit from Wikipedia. And I know Genius is a website that a lot of people have been critical of, and I do have some issues with it myself as well. but it can be a good place to go and find out more about some albums sometimes. And a contributor on that website makes an interesting point that the sample used here from a religious lecture is used more in this track as an instrument than as actual lyrics. And it's a pretty strong track to kick off the full-length tracks on this album, if you ask me. Next is Hydrogen, Helium, Lithium, Leviathan, which has a pretty cool title, and instead of trying to analyze why they chose that title, I'm just going to review what's right in front of me, and that's a piece of instrumental music that is mostly good, and I like the long, drawn-out synths that wash over the listener, and the timbre of the melodic synths that come in later is quite nice, but the percussion does feel like it overpowers this track a bit, and it does hold it back from being better in my opinion. Then there's Age of Capricorn, and I'm a little confused about this one. I find the spelling a little bit obnoxious, even if the instrumental beneath it is quite pleasant, and I'm not totally sure what's being spelled. Wikipedia says it's talking about Osama bin Laden, but it's spelled U-S-A-M-A and then something with M-A-B-U-S, although apparently Mabus, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, is an alleged predecessor to the third Antichrist, also according to Wikipedia. And along with the sample of Jack Van Impe trying to absolve people of their sins, it's one of the moments here where I'm really starting to think a lot about how much I can really find meaning in an album like this. I'm personally not always a huge fan of this kind of abstract album where you have to know context of what all the samples are to really properly understand it and try and piece together things like song titles and stuff like that. But I think Boards of Canada are better at this than most acts, and as a result, I'm a bit more invested in trying to piece some of these things together. But at a certain point, I've got to draw a line, and I'm also not going to properly understand this album. I gotta admit that. And it means that I'm not always going to care that much about analyzing all of this. Prime example being the next track, Father and Son, which is just straight up obnoxious. So let's skip ahead to talking about Somewhere Right Now in the Future, another interesting song title. And there are no vocal samples in this one, just completely instrumental ambient music, and this one's a little trippy, and honestly in a good way. It kind of bends your brain a bit, but I really like the trippy effect that this has on me as a listener, and at this point I'm much more invested in the album after such an underwhelming track before it. And it's followed up by the track Naraka, which according to the Genius description is named after the region of hell in the Dharmic religions, where souls are purified of sin before they can be reincarnated. And I really love the haunting synths all over this track. It's one that's hard to explain, but it really works, and I also quite like the vocals here as well. I'm not sure if it's a sample or not, but the lyrics are in Sanskrit and repeat 3 names which are in the Hare Krishna mantra, which I'll admit is something I don't know much about, but based on a tiny bit of research I did, it seems like it has something to do with realizing God or making a request to God or something like that, but you can correct me if I'm wrong. Either way, this track does have a very holy feeling to it, which would make sense, I guess, if I'm understanding it correctly. Acts of Magic feels like a quick interlude track, although it definitely builds tension really well. And then there's Memory Death, which seems like a pretty typical ambient song until you realize it quite likely represents someone dying, as you can hear the horrifying cries for help along with the beeping of a hospital bed, as the Genius description pointed out, and I think they're probably right about their interpretation of this one. Honestly, it's good sequencing to go from the previous interlude track into this one. And then The Word Becomes Flesh uses a vocal sample of a film called Introduction to Development, which shows a chicken embryo's development. And it's definitely not one of my favorite tracks here, with the sample becoming a bit obnoxious after a while, and I also just don't really like the percussion on this track that much, which sounds overly snappy. Although the synth work is pretty cool here, I will admit. And then there's the 4.5 minute Into the Magic Land, which starts off immediately intriguing with some more haunting synths and a bit of a choppy sound that is clearly intentional. And it is unfortunately another moment where the percussion can feel a bit distracting and doesn't quite fit the vibe for me, even if I really like the other elements of the track. Anyway, we get back into potentially more meaningful territory on Blood in the Labyrinth, which samples a documentary about the drug PCP, which I admittedly don't know a ton about, but the sample features someone talking about being violent, and then there's a different voice talking about watching someone die. And on this track, I actually like the percussion quite a bit. It sounds really good in the mix and also really adds to the vibe quite well. Honestly, I really like the progression of the track as well, and considering the content and the samples, it's pretty goddamn haunting, as a reminder of how bad the consequences of using hard drugs can be. And right from the start of Deep Time, it feels like a continuation of that heartbreaking feeling that Blood in the Labyrinth brings to this album, maybe even like the aftermath of all that. But on Deep Time, there's quite a heavenly feeling that eventually comes out of the track as it evolves. And while it's maybe not the most fitting thing considering how powerful the sequencing decision was to go from the previous track into this one, it is still quite a beautiful moment regardless. And then things seem to get more gloomy at the end of this track, which then transitions into All Reasoned Parts, which samples Megiddo 2, The New Age. That's a 2005 film about a specific New Age movement that reawakened communication with the spirit realm, and I think looks at said awakening from a critical perspective, if I'm understanding correctly, but I've never seen the film and I could only find a few brief descriptions of it. Anyway, I'm not entirely sure what all of that means, but I do sort of wonder if this track, and maybe the sample too, represents prioritizing what's actually here in front of us in real life, rather than other realms which we can't even confirm exist. I'm quite likely wrong about this, but either way, I do like the track and how subtly gloomy it feels, without going full-on haunting mode like so many of these tracks do. Then we get the fourth to last track on the album, Arena Americanada, another song title that raises some questions for me, and I immediately notice the bass that ascends and descends in some interesting ways, which then leads to more synths to come in and really add to the texture of this song. Although the busy percussion feels distracting, honestly the percussion often does get in the way of this album being better than it is. I couldn't really find anything about the sample used in the third to last track, The Process, but it is quite haunting with the crowd noise in the background, and I really like the addition of the piano later on that really takes over the piece. And then after that there are only two more songs, with the penultimate track being You Retreat in Time and Space, which is probably one of the more easy to enjoy tracks here, where it almost sounds like pleasant video game music designed to be easy listening. And while I don't love this track, I think it's a cool, unexpectedly jolly sounding penultimate track, even if there is some darkness to its sound as well, which also does not feel totally out of place on a track like this. It is at least interesting, I'll give it that. Then the album ends with I Saw Through Platonia, which is based on a recording of a human heartbeat, and beyond that it's a pretty simple ambient piece, and then it just ends. And all of this leads me to ask the overall question, what is the meaning of this album as a full project? Is there some larger meaning to it all when you piece it all together? Or is it just about experiencing it and feeling whatever feelings come with an album like this? Or maybe you're supposed to give it your own meaning? I'm going to guess that latter option is probably the most likely. There seem to be some potential religious themes, although I'm not really sure what the message they're trying to get across is, or whether it's religious or just using religion as a way to send some other kind of message, maybe even one that goes against the religions referenced here. I'm honestly not sure, so I'm curious to hear what you think in the comments section. But if I had to give this album a meaning that I personally interpret from it, regardless of whether or not I actually think it was the intended meaning, I guess maybe I'd mention the horrifying reality of death, which on certain moments here does feel like a central theme, and on such a haunting album it makes sense. The end of the closing track really feels like it captures this probably more than any other moment here. Maybe it's taking these hauntology tropes and reminding us that eventually we're going to be the generation that old samples are taken from, where we're nothing but a distant memory. Yeah, that got real dark real quickly, but I'm honestly not sure at all if my interpretation of this is correct. But it is abstract art, and it's probably meant to be analyzed in these ways and interpreted differently by different people. But I guess bringing this back to music review territory, although this did not really go as off the rails as I thought it might, how am I supposed to finish this review? What are my overall thoughts on Inferno by Boards of Canada? Well, it's definitely not an easy listen, nor is it one that I'd recommend throwing on in the background at a party or anything like that. It's quite spooky, but not really in a way that feels Halloween-like or anything. Okay, maybe a little, but it's a lot more dark and truly haunting than just silly and spooky. It's not really a silly album at all, actually, if you ask me. I'm not entirely sure why I chose to use that word. It's also kind of inconsistent, and the percussion often isn't really fitting on quite a few tracks, where it's just more distracting than anything, and it does take away from some of the power that these tracks could have had. It's also not an album that really feels designed for individual standout tracks, but the issues that I have with the percussion do take away from the overall album experience, and there are also a decent handful of tracks that I don't really think keep me engaged with the album experience all the way through. And as a result of all this, I don't think I can call this great, despite the huge amounts of critical acclaim, so I'll give this a 7 out of 10 because I do still think it's got a lot going for it, and in the right setting, it's absolutely worth hearing. Just be prepared that this album is a lot to take in, and yet I still unfortunately don't think it's as great as Boards of Canada have been at their best. Still, for a comeback release 13 years after their previous album, it certainly could have been worse. And while some people might see this and be upset that I'm not absolutely in love with it like so many critics are, I'll still acknowledge the quality that's here, and that there's probably so much that I'm missing about this album, and also a lot that I may have noticed about it that's not actually here. Which reminds me to say, feel free to let me know if I got anything wrong about any of the samples or anything, although I'm pretty sure I described this all accurately, even if my personal interpretations of the album's meaning may or may not be correct. But anyway, feel free to let me know what you thought of Inferno by Boards of Canada, and or what you thought of my video. I think that's all I really got to say on this album for now. I am planning some more individual album reviews, hopefully, which hopefully will be published fairly soon. I'm kind of surprised I've been able to get out this many recently as I have. I just published 2 individual reviews yesterday and then 1 today. So, yeah, I mean, some of these have been in the works for a while. I have been listening to this album, for example, for quite a while, but I'm just finally now getting around to actually making a video about it and publishing it. And yeah, I think that's all I really got to say for now. Thank you so much for watching. I'll be back soon with hopefully more individual album reviews. If not, I'll be back soon with some mini reviews. And yeah, I think that's all I really got to say for now. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all soon.